All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our online webinar on the water levels in the St. Lawrence River in our community. My name is Eric Duncan. I'm the Member of Parliament for Stormont-Dundas-South Glengarry, and I hope this finds everybody well in these challenging and different times. We're doing this actually. One of the things that's come out of the pandemic in the last year is, although we're used to getting together for town halls and different meetings like we have in the past, Zoom has become a regular name in a lot of our households the last little while. If it's been Facebook Live or Zoom, and I'm pleased to have some colleagues and some experts on the water levels issue in our riding along the St. Lawrence River. And I say between the dam in Iroquois and in Cornwall, the Lake St. Lawrence area, to talk about specifically our neck of the woods and our area when it comes to water levels. I always tease colleagues when we get underway with these things in meetings in Ottawa. I get very little sympathy because as we look at the Great Lakes system all across the province and US states, many communities, hundreds of communities face flooding challenges very often of high water levels. In our area, we have the opposite problem, more of a unique problem that very often when communities face high water levels, we're facing drastically low water levels. So what I'm pleased today is to have some colleagues from the International Joint Commission. I'll introduce Erica in a moment to introduce herself, and Dr. Jeff from the River Institute to give us some perspective on a more local angle of us and what does it mean and why are the things happening that are happening and some of the science and information and details behind that. So we have Erica, I'll allow you to introduce yourself and your title, and I'll do Dr. Jeff, and then we'll get into your presentation to start.
Sure, my name is Erica Claseco, and I'm an engineering advisor with the Canadian section of the International Joint Commission. I'm located in Ottawa, and I'm also a liaison to the Great Lakes Control Board. So one of which is the International Lake Ontario St. Lawrence River Board, which people may be familiar with, but I'll speak a little bit about that later.
And one of our other duties having to put up with me sometimes as members of Parliament with interested questions. And Dr. Jeff is a familiar face to us in Eastern Ontario with the St. Lawrence River Institute, a wonderful organization. Dr. Jeff, allow you to introduce yourself, and good to see you.
Well, thank you, and thanks for that nice words, MP Duncan. My name is Jeff Ruddle, Executive Director with the River Institute, and I actually have with me, joining me, one of our scientists who's been doing a lot of the work on this water levels issue with respect to ecology is Matt Windle, one of our research scientists. So we'll look forward to telling you a little bit of our story in a bit.
Wonderful. So I'm going to pass it over to Erica. Erica has several slides to go over just to give people an idea as you're watching this on your couch or your computer over the next few minutes here. Erica's going to give some backgrounder on the IJC, how things go to give an overview. I find a lot of residents are at different spots in terms of their knowledge of the IJC and how they control and how in some cases they don't control the water levels and some of the reasons behind that. Then we're going to have that. And then Dr. Jeff is going to talk more on the scientific side. When we have low water levels, what that means for our local habitat and some of the environmental challenges that are there and maybe are not there as well. And then I have some general questions, what I call frequently asked questions. Why do we have low water levels when others have high? And get into a bit of a discussion with our two experts while we have it here. So Erica, I'm going to turn my video off, as is Dr. Jeff, and we'll pass it over to you to give our residents an intro from the perspective of the IJC.
All right, thank you. And I will share my screen here. And hopefully technology does not fail us. All right, so as I mentioned before, I'm an engineering advisor with the International Joint Commission's Canadian section. So I'll just begin by giving a little bit of an overview of what the commission is. So the International Joint Commission is a binational organization that was created by Canada and the US through the Boundary Waters Treaty. The IJC is made up of 6 commissioners who are appointed by the highest level of government in each country. And although the commission is a creation of governments, it operates very much independently of government policy direction. The commissioners really work as a single body to prevent and resolve disputes between the two countries over its shared waters. And one of the main functions of the commission is to rule on applications for structures that affect the boundary water. So the Moses Saunders Dam at Cornwall is an example of this type of a structure. So as we know, the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River system is the largest, most populated, and probably the most economically important transboundary region that's shared by Canada and the US. And in 1952, the IJC approved an application from the US and Canadian governments for the construction of a hydropower project on the St. Lawrence River, downstream of the natural outlet of Lake Ontario. Now, when the Moses Saunders Dam was constructed, the section of the river directly upstream of the dam was flooded, creating what we now call today Lake St. Lawrence. And so that's the section shown on your screen here in the triangle that's between Iroquois and Cornwall. So the Moses Saunders Dam is used to control the outflow of Lake Ontario, but it also impacts the water levels in the St. Lawrence River from Lake Ontario all the way downstream to Trois-Rivières in Quebec. Now, when the IJC approves such a project, it may impose conditions to protect interests on either side of the boundary. These conditions are known as orders of approval. So the regulation plan for Lake Ontario, which is known as Plan 2014, takes into consideration the many interests both upstream and downstream of the dam. And some of those are listed here on this slide. Now, the International Lake Ontario St. Lawrence River Board was created by the Commission to ensure that the conditions of the order are met. And Plan 2014 does contain some provisions that are specific to Lake St. Lawrence, including water level and flow limits to maintain safe conditions for navigation through the St. Lawrence Seaway, and to protect municipal and industrial water intakes, particularly during times of low water during the winter. The board also has the authority for minor deviations from the plan. So this allows the board to make some short-term flow adjustments that can temporarily impact the water levels of Lake St. Lawrence. And we've seen the board exercise this authority over the past 3 years when water levels have been quite low in the fall, and they've assisted with the haul out activities at some of the marinas and yacht clubs in the fall. It's also worth noting, though, that the order does also protect Lake St. Lawrence from extremely high water events through the operation of the gates at Iroquois Dam upstream of Moses Saunders. Now, this slide shows a profile of the St. Lawrence River from Lake Ontario, which is on the left of your screen, to Montreal on the right. So I don't want to get overly technical here, but it's important to understand that the outflow of Lake Ontario is really determined by the difference in the water level of Lake Ontario and Lake St. Lawrence. So the greater that difference is, the greater the outflow from the dam. This graphic shows that it basically illustrates that an outflow increase at the Moses Saunders Dam that would cause the level of Lake Ontario to decrease by 1 centimeter over a period of 1 week would cause the level of Lake St. Lawrence directly upstream of the dam to decrease by 15 centimeters. And so the impact of this is lessened as you go upstream. However, since 2017, due to the persistently wet conditions throughout the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River system that we've seen, we've had extremely high outflows from Lake Ontario, and at times record high. And so this has really translated to the low water conditions that we're talking about today. So recognizing the unique challenges that this region faces, so by those who live, work, or use the water along the shoreline of Lake St. Lawrence, the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River Adaptive Management Committee, which is a committee of the IJC that's responsible for monitoring and assessing the impacts of Plan 2014, launched a number of projects and initiatives that are really aimed at better understanding the impacts to the area. So these initiatives have included scientific investigations to assess the risk of low winter water levels on municipal and industrial water intakes, ice conditions, as well as the ecology. And my colleagues at the River Institute have been involved in some of these studies, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later today. And more recently, the GLAM committee held engagement workshops with staff from municipalities along the shoreline to better understand the difficulties faced by the individual communities. And GLAM is also looking at launching a series of listening sessions through which they hope to engage with representatives from Indigenous nations and tribes along the shoreline. And lastly, the Commission recently established a public advisory group to GLAM, which includes representation from Lake St. Lawrence. And this advisory group will really assist the GLAM committee in its review of the regulation plan by contributing local knowledge about water level impacts. And finally, I'll just leave you with a collection of links here that perhaps can be shared later. And it's just important to note that the International Lake Ontario St. Lawrence River Board has created a section of their site that's dedicated to Lake St. Lawrence, and there's plenty of information there for those who wish to learn more. So with that, I will pass it back over and end my sharing.
Awesome. Thank you, Erica. Appreciate that. And what we'll say to everybody with these links, we're going to have a website link available to watch this on YouTube, and you'll find on that page those links as well, direct links that Erica had talking about some of the extra resources and information that you can get about the IJC and the work. So I'll invite back Dr. Jeff to give some presentation and a lot of comments. I remember being a new member of Parliament, Dr. Jeff, 15 months ago now, and one of the first local files we had to deal with were the quite alarming low water levels in our section of the St. Lawrence River. And a lot of people were concerned, obviously, for a variety of for safety reasons and a lot of habitat, shoreline erosions, and some of those issues. And as I said before, we're very lucky to have the River Institute in our community doing a wide variety of environmental research. But I want to invite you and Matt and your team to talk a little bit about how the River Institute was able to do some research in our area that we're talking about between Iroquois and Cornwall, and look at some of those impacts different times of the year, I believe, as well, about what low water levels do from an environmental perspective. So I'll pass it over to you to give us a backgrounder on your findings.
Well, thanks very much. It's great to be able to speak about the work that we've done and it's continuing to do on the system, Eric, and thanks, Erica, for the overview. And she mentioned, Erica mentioned the fact that this Great Lakes Adaptive Management Committee was established primarily to look at, see how it's sort of like an ongoing adjustment, ongoing improvement of their overall water plans and the regulation, and to see how, kind of take into account some of the effects that there might be seen or under the new water level regime. And one of the ones that we've heard about, obviously, is subject to this discussion, is the low water levels that is encountered in Lake St. Lawrence and this part of the region above the dam. And certainly we've heard about it, and there were concerns from the community, being in the community directly, people asking us questions about what's happening, how does this affect the fish? How does this affect other wildlife that might be, seeing these low water levels, particularly starting off with the concerns in the fall, where you really, have seen the water levels reduced over the past number of years. And as a result of that, and also with the opportunity, we proposed the study to the GLAM committee through the International Joint Commission to look at those the impacts of what might be happening to the fish there that are experiencing these low water levels in the fall. And this was led by Matt Windle, who will speak to it a little bit more and some of the other work that we've done. And the bottom line is, it turns out that when we looked at mostly desktop work, but also based on our experience and what we know from a large project of sampling fish in the nearshore region for the St. Lawrence River. This is something we call the FINS project, the Fish Identification Nearshore Study, that we've been conducting now for a number of years to look at all the different species of fish that are located along the St. Lawrence River in the nearshore areas. And this has been a really interesting partnership with the Mohawks of Akwesasne that first posed this question of what's happening with the nearshore species. And so based on this data set of over 100,000 fish, we were able to kind of know what fish are where they occur, and in different sections of the river. And the study, when we looked at it, and those species that are known to be in the St. Lawrence River and Lake St. Lawrence, we realized that most of those fish almost entirely all spawn in the spring when water levels are high, typically in the system. And there was only very few species that would be affected with respect to spawning or any other kind of habitat related in the fall when we have the low water levels. So that doesn't mean to say it's all great and low water levels won't affect fish in the fall at all. But in most cases, this doesn't seem to be kind of one of those where you have really vulnerable species because they're spawning and that sort of thing. So, I mean, that was positive news with respect to it, the fall conditions. We also conducted a second study where we looked at winter drawdown impacts, and that was pretty recent, and it's also concern, as in very recent years, the low water levels have been, and in fact, the IJC was proposing a deviation from their normal water level regime in the wintertime. And so they were interested to know what kind of impacts might be achieved if the water levels went extremely low. So we were able to do some work there. And most of that work it's hard. Most biologists and ecologists don't get to work too much in the nearshore area in the wintertime because of the unsafe difficulty with the water and the ice at that time of year. And we were able to identify, the species that might be at risk, and sort of what those areas of the river that could be affected, and particularly at species that would be established burrowing species like turtles and others, and so that was something, that information that we provided to the IJC, and I believe the feedback was they found that very useful, and it was something that they have been using in terms of guidance. That's a couple of the work that we've done, but we've always just carried on additional studies that, based on just the research that we're carrying on with this fish identification nearshore. And I'll pass it to Matt Windle to share a couple of slides to tell you about the work that he's been doing, that he's going to show us about. So Matt, are you able to share your slides? Just bear with us while that comes up. I'll pass it to Matt.
Great. Can you see that, Jeff?
Yep. Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jeff. That was a really good overview of some of the recent studies we've done on behalf of the IJC, and Erica provided a really good context of the functioning of the system in terms of water levels, managing those from Lake Ontario all the way down the river. So I'm just going to briefly talk a little bit about what we know about the ecology of Lake St. Lawrence, and a particular study that we did a few years ago in response to some of these community concerns about the effects of low water levels. So this is just a nice slide of some species we've actually caught in Lake St. Lawrence. It has quite a bit of biodiversity. Erica did show a slide of Lake St. Lawrence, so from essentially Iroquois all the way to Cornwall, between those two water control structures. And this slide just shows that zoomed in feature there. And you can also see an area highlighted of Hoople Bay. It's about 6 kilometers upstream of the Moses Saunders Dam. And this is an area that we've studied intensely actually over the years, because it's a very shallow bay. So it's really highly affected by water level fluctuations that occur. So very small drops in water levels end up exposing large areas of river bottom in this area. So in terms of studying the impacts of water levels on the ecology of Lake St. Lawrence, this makes a really good study area for us. Just talking about the ecology of Lake St. Lawrence, before the Moses Saunders Dam was constructed, it was actually a very narrow, fast-flowing section of the river. There's a large rapid section, and it was used by several fish species that are especially adapted to that type of really fast-flowing water, like sturgeon and walleye and suckers. And then following the construction of the dam, it ended up creating this large impoundment upstream of the dam, and flooding lots of shallow habitat, so agricultural fields, things like that. So we had a 200% increase in shallow habitat in that section of the river. So this greatly modified what the ecology of this section of the river looked like following the 1960s. And with the water level fluctuations, both due to controls of water level regimes and just natural fluctuations as well, you ended up seeing large fluctuations in water in some of these newly created shallow habitats. So they're over decades, they've been exposed to sometimes daily, sometimes weekly and seasonally water level fluctuations that affect the ecosystem from the ground up. So that's plants and vertebrates and the fish that feed on those. So this whole, all these newly created shallow areas have essentially been adapting to this type of regime for the past 60 years. From our desktop studies, we know that surveys by both the Canadian and US governments, and as well as the River Institute and Mohawks of Akwesasne, we've all documented approximately 70 species of fish that inhabit that section of the river. So that's fairly comparable actually to other sections of the river downstream of Cornwall and also the Thousand Islands. There's also species of types of frogs and turtles that live there as well. It also has a very high seasonally important migratory bird habitat that make use of the river in the Upper Canada Migratory Bird Sanctuary. So plants and animals for the past 60 years have adapted to these fluctuations that weren't really happening as dramatically prior to the 1960s. And also, so we saw some adaptations there. In 2019, in 2018 and 2017, members of the Cornwall community and others were expressing some concern. They were seeing low water levels in the fall. And in this lower picture here, you can see some exposed riverbed with lots of lily pads just lying on the ground. The typical scene in the fall in some of these years. So in response to these concerns, we decided to do a really intensive study of the Hoople Bay area, that I mentioned earlier, that experiences very extreme water level fluctuations. So we started from spring all the way to the fall. We went every 2 weeks, and we just did sampling of the fish community. We looked at water quality. We looked at plants and vertebrates. We did essentially the whole ecosystem in several areas of Hoople Bay. And here's a map showing all of our sites around Hoople Bay, and the ones in red are the ones that we ended up visiting on a bi-weekly basis there. And these photos really convey the drop in water levels that happened from spring and early summer to fall. So on the left, you see the same area flooded in May and June, and then in September, it's quite dry. There's not much water level left. There's still fish living in that narrow band of water, though, in this one section of Hoople Bay. And our teams will go out with seine nets and collect fish and identify everything as part of our survey. So you can see the team in action there. What we ended up finding in Hoople Bay, we caught about 7,000 fish, and we identified over 20 species of fish that made use of this shallow water habitat from the spring all the way to the fall. Just to put that in context, that's very comparable to other sections of the river that don't experience these fluctuations. And in several species of fish, we're making very good use of the habitat for spawning in the spring and summer. So things like northern pike and catfish and sunfish. So the diversity and abundance that we saw, even in this highly impacted area in Hoople Bay of Lake St. Lawrence, is very comparable to upstream and downstream habitats that we also survey as part of our larger nearshore fish survey program we've had going on for the past 6 years and intend to keep going on. There's much more to learn, as Jeff mentioned, in terms of winter impacts of water levels. That's just something that we haven't had a chance to do actively as a program, just based on some difficulties of working in the winter. But it's something that we really wanted to get into and perhaps address based on some of the concerns we've been hearing as well. So things like our fish being stranded in the winter below the ice. In some instances, that'd be something that we would want to maybe follow up with more study and work. But I'll pass it back to you, Jeff.
You're on mute, Dr. Jeff.
We need that coffee mug that says you're muted. So thanks very much. I just thank Matt for the presentation and say, I just follow up is that this is ongoing research, and we like to be the ears, have our ears to the ground and the local contact together with, Council of Akwesasne has its researchers, as does the Conservation Authority. So any of the local agencies and groups really would like to hear your concerns. And if you do spot issues, please contact us. And obviously we'll get in touch with the IJC to let them know the latest information. So back to you, Eric.
Thanks, Dr. Jeff. And just while we're on that, before we get into the questions and welcome Erica back, I did contact you guys and you were very helpful. I'm going to say it was about a year ago when suddenly I was getting photos from the Morrisburg Iroquois area that there was a foamy substance of some sort along the shorelines of the St. Lawrence, and you guys were able to go out and do some work on that. And do you want to talk a little bit about that and what happened there in that case?
Yeah, it was an interesting issue where it was actually an algae that we were able to identify that had, given the time of year and the conditions and the fact that, again, our water levels go up and down. So There was a period of time the water levels were higher at the right time when that algae bloomed. And then when water levels receded, we saw the algae coating the rocks in the nearshore area. And we were able to put those scrapings, we went out, grabbed some scrapings, put them under a microscope and identified the algae. That was it. And, you know, we got that call from a number of people. So it was kind of a unique situation that people maybe not see every year just because of the conditions, again, in this part of the world.
For sure. Well, it would look apocalyptic at first when I first got the email. So what's going on in Morrisburg and Iroquois? But it was good, and I remember putting that on Facebook and sharing that that it was algae and some of the background and how safe it was, and then learning as well further upstream. There were some cases actually upstream and downstream in the past. There had been some, but again, very rare, and again, a benefit to having the River Institute in our community. Dr. Jeff, if I could start with you and you and Matt in your work there, but the presentation focuses on habitat and being able to do the work you did in Hoople Bay. A question that I get very often is about shoreline erosion or shoreline issues that happen from high and low water levels or the water levels fluctuating. What concern do you have, if any, on that from an environmental aspect? Is that something you might consider more down the road, or should people not be as concerned of any shoreline issues with low water levels?
Well, yeah, I believe that is one of the issues that people want to be aware of, and that we do hear concerns about. And there's a number of, you know, mechanisms that can be at play here. And with respect to, you know, the ice effects, and as the ice gets drawn up and down, and its ability to move and larger, you know, let's say larger structures like stones or something that have been placed there, and that up and down motion can cause gradual motion of those structures that are meant to stabilize the shore bank. So I know that's actually, you know, I'm bringing that example up because that's a concern we have. I'm a member of the Stormont Yacht Club and the sailing club out along Sioux, and this is one of the things that we notice out of the club, that this can occur. We also reach other, there's a variety of potential factors that can cause shoreline erosion. So not just water levels, but of course other effects like shipping traffic. And there's a study that the real go-to group, I would say, groups that for shoreline considerations and erosion are really the conservation authorities. And they have established the expertise to address it because they also have a regulatory role in there in terms of shorelines. So South Nation and Raisin Region Conservation Authority are really the go-to groups to bring their shoreline concerns to, although we're certainly happy to listen and provide our feedback.
You're giving us ideas for our next video Zoom seminar here of maybe having our conservation authorities in. Erica, over to you to talk about in your presentation. So let me just get the most frequently asked question that I get that we can try to summarize as easily as possible. Parts of the Great Lakes system have very high water levels. At the same time, our region may have very low water levels. Why is that? And you address that in your presentation, but a summary about why is that. And B, is there a fix or an opportunity where the IJC could work with the dams in Iroquois and Cornwall, perhaps to close them more at different times to raise water levels? Why isn't there the opportunity, or hasn't been taken, to raise them in different ways or manners when there are low water levels? Can you address that a little bit?
Yeah, certainly. So as I did mention in the presentation, the real issue is that we have, you know, when you have high water levels on Lake Ontario, or even regular water levels, if you're trying to remove a lot of water from the lake, it causes this drawdown effect. So if you think of the effect of if you have like a bathtub and then you suddenly pull the drain, that slope of water that happens towards the outlet is really what we're seeing. So you have a large difference between the levels on Lake Ontario and Lake St. Lawrence. Now, the need to release a lot of water may be very obvious in times when Lake Ontario is flooding and we have really high water, but it may be less obvious to people why it's needed right now. For instance, in the fall, you know, Lake Ontario has been approaching its long-term average since really late summer and this fall. But the issue is that the upper Great Lakes right now are still extremely high. We've seen record conditions on the upper lakes. They're still very close to their record highs, and all of that water needs to move through the system. So it all has to go through Lake St. Lawrence. And in order to reduce the risk of severe flooding in the spring, really now is the opportune time to try to pass that water. So before the snow on the ground starts to melt and all the spring rain comes, we really need to try to get all of that water out of the system to avoid severe impacts in the spring.
Noted. And I think that's one of the things too that we mentioned in our looking out the roadway, for an example, in Hoople Bay along County Road 2, and seeing that low water level. That is because they're trying to pass through. Suction is a right word I try to use as well, but yeah, drawing the bathtub of getting that water out and what's created there. So I do agree with residents that it is, from an aesthetics perspective, being able to use boats at certain times of the year. Dr. Jeff mentions about the yacht club, for an example. That poses a real challenge. But when we have communities that are being flooded, their backyards being destroyed, shoreline erosion, marinas being damaged year after year, it's the part we have to play as part of that system to draw that water out. But I'll ask another question. Are there infrastructure investments? So IJC works to control the water levels, and you're at the mercy of Mother Nature, probably being the biggest factor of anything. Are there things the IJC is recommending that the federal government, Canadian, US, obviously being between both countries, are there things that can be done that if the government spent, I'll just throw a few $billion, and I don't mean to demean that by calling that pocket change, but are there infrastructure investments that could be made in other parts of the Great Lakes to put water in another area, or to hold it longer, or to do something along those lines to take the pressure off the rest of the Great Lakes and perhaps the low water levels in our region? Have you speak to that? I know you guys don't have the dollars for that. You're not the politicians and the bank account very often, but the messengers. But are there things that IJC has identified as things the government can do to mitigate this? And I'll just wrap that up by saying, this likely is the new norm with the levels we're seeing. What was happening on a cycle, maybe every decade or 20 years, is becoming more and more frequent. So it may not be every single year there's as bad of or big of a challenge, but it's going to be more often than in the past, I think. So I'll let you address that myriad of questions I asked you.
Yeah, and I should say that the infrastructure that's in place right now does, as I mentioned in the presentation, does protect Lake St. Lawrence to a certain extent from the very high levels. So in cases where the water levels are getting very high, they can dip the gates at Iroquois to prevent Lake St. Lawrence, which is the forebay to the dam, from getting too high. Now, specific to Lake St. Lawrence, there hasn't been any investigations to my knowledge, at least not since the system was designed back in the 50s, as to how to mitigate low water through infrastructure. But I can say that the government has had the IJC investigate this issue elsewhere within the Great Lakes and in other boundary waters as well, to really look at sort of what sort of infrastructure changes could be implemented to mitigate water fluctuations, for instance. But the reality is that in all of these situations, not only are these engineering solutions often prohibitively costly, so they do take a lot of money. It would involve excessive amounts of dredging and large structures and that sort of thing. But it often really just moves the problem elsewhere. The reality is that you have a lot of water in these cases, so the inflow to Lake Ontario, for instance, is not controlled by any means. It's just whatever is coming down from the upper lakes and whatever is running off the surface of the land. And so there's really, the water needs to go somewhere. So it's often, if you're trying to mitigate the issues in one area, you're just sending them downstream. And often if you're trying to solve problems on the Great Lakes, and the St. Lawrence River is the one that suffers. So it definitely is a difficult solution to try to engineer your way out of.
Well, and I say is that, in terms of our area suffering, everybody is suffering. It's just our version of it in one sense too, of where there are these astronomically high water levels everywhere. Our suffering is the low water levels. And I think thankfully that we don't have the opposite problem. I see some of the photos from colleagues of the high water levels going in and wiping out subdivisions or clearing out subdivisions every couple of years. I don't enjoy the low water level issue, and we'll keep working in these things of what we can do on communications and expectations and timelines and safety and property values. But I know on the other hand, again, when I go to Ottawa and you're advocating on those issues, I have colleagues that have family homes that have been flooded out 3 times in the last 5 years, and they won't get insurance anymore, and they've been on waterfront property for 50 years. So it is that balance of it all there. Could we talk a little bit about the marine traffic? And I'm not sure, Dr. Jeff, if you may want to chip in on this from the from an environmental perspective as well. A key factor is not only trying to take water levels, water off when you can, but also navigating no pun intended, the politics or the calendars of the shipping industry, which is billions and billions and billions of dollars to the Ontario, Quebec, and several US states as well. So can you talk about that bit of a balance that the IJC has to achieve at different times of the year to allow ships to pass through safely in there? And maybe I'll ask that second question as well. Are there infrastructure investments that could be made with dredging or other things that might be able to balance the shipping and the water levels issue it a little bit more at different times of the year?
Yeah, no, I can definitely talk a little bit about, so the Plan 2014, so the regulation plan for Lake Ontario does include something that's called the L limit, which anybody who's read the board webpage would be familiar with this. And so this is really a limit that's imposed during the navigation season, which is typically end of March till December 31st, but it varies year to year. So there's a maximum flow limit that is allowed, that is based on the level of Lake Ontario. And this is really to ensure that there's safe conditions for navigation in the St. Lawrence River, particularly through the Seaway, where we've heard from mariners and the Seaway corporations that these very high flows cause cross currents that render it very hard to navigate ships through the locks. As they enter the locks, they need to slow down and they lose the ability to navigate if these cross currents are too high. But there's also a provision in there for not allowing Lake St. Lawrence to get too low because they need a minimum water level for draft. And so that's imposed during the navigation season. Now, during the non-navigation season, such as now, where it's an opportunity to perhaps pass more flow because you don't have to worry about ships in the channel, there's still that minimum water level that needs to be maintained on Lake St. Lawrence, as I mentioned, for water intakes and for other interests as well. But I don't think I can speak very much to the infrastructure. I don't know, a lot of it is there's different, I do know that there's different challenges at different sections of the river that are encountered. So the minimum water level distance is generally what's needed at Long Sault, but really the conditions change so much depending on winds and cross currents and so on. They're very particular challenges at different water levels, different conditions throughout the channel. So I can't really speak to any sort of infrastructure upgrades that the Seaway could implement, though. Sorry.
Well, it just gives us a chance to have the Seaway Management Board, hopefully in the future meeting, the corporation, to talk about the shipping angle on that and to ask some of those questions and what their advice may be. Dr. Jeff, do you have any comment on that in the shipping industry?
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I'm not, that's not my area of expertise, but I've been obviously an avid follower of all of the related issues, and my understanding is that one of the things that over the past number of years is the shipping industry has been asked to push that L limit and to push the kind of to see how far they can go and still feel safe. So they've gained some experience on that. And I know there's been also some additional barges and other things to help support different parts of the system to help support the shipping industry. So there's some lessons learned there, and I believe at least that they've played a role in trying to mitigate the conditions as much as possible. But obviously that there are some limits in terms of the safe navigation that really at the end of the day that we have to. If we want to have a shipping industry, if that's the case, then you have to respect and nothing like a major accident that would really make it very unfortunate if that would occur. So I understand the limitations there.
For sure, the safety first aspect. Well, I appreciate both your times. And Erica, what I'm just going to do is leave you with the final question. As people are watching this video, just giving a timeline, we're at the end of January 2021. what are the expected water levels in the Great Lakes as a whole? And then when you're looking at our section of the river here in the coming months, let's maybe say the next 3-4 months, what are the projections for the water levels on both of those? Are we going to see a lot of fluctuations, and how detailed are you able to get into that in terms of what the projections may be?
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely say that the upper lakes, we know that there's a ton of water in the system, as I've said, and they're expected to remain high. Even under dry conditions, they're going to remain well above average for at least the 6-month outlook. So definitely for the foreseeable future. For Lake Ontario, we are close to the long-term average, and so it's really going to mostly depend on the type of conditions that we have going forward and what happens in the basin. Now, the conditions on Lake St. Lawrence can actually, they can be quite dependent on what happens with ice. So we've had a very mild winter so far. So we've been continually passing a lot of water, but as soon as there's ice formation, we really need to reduce outflow to ensure that there's a stable ice cover that's formed downstream and upstream of the dam. So, and we certainly don't want to have any risks of ice jams, because that would just be devastating on many levels. The impacts to shoreline erosion, it would reduce our ability to pass outflow. So that's something that the regulation representatives of the International Lake Ontario St. Lawrence River Board monitor very closely on a daily basis. So they'll be monitoring ice conditions. Now, once a stable ice cover does form, they can increase outflow again. So a lot of it's just going to depend on the weather going forward, unfortunately. But we can expect that there's going to be continued high outflows at every opportunity because there's so much water in the system. So.
Sure. Well, no, I appreciate the information you both shared with us, and I hope our residents that are affected by the river water levels in the St. Lawrence River have got some information out of this today. This is the first in several of what we just call an education series, giving the background. I'm doing a lot of advocating in Ottawa on water level issues of what we can do, and getting different departments together on the same page and addressing the wide variety of different things, not only from a federal government, but the provincial government, municipal government, and also both in the Canada and US side. But one of the things we can do in the interim is to provide information to our local residents about the why in some of these situations, and really give that truly local context. So Erica and Dr. Jeff, to Matt, the teams at the IJC and the River Institute, I appreciate this very much. And I'll say to anybody watching, if you have questions you would like us to address, different speakers you'd like to have us in, please email my office, eric.duncan@parl.gc.ca. And at the end of this, you'll have some links, and also on the website link, you'll have some opportunities to look at the extra resources, as was mentioned by the IJC and by the River Institute. So with that, thank you to Dr. Jeff. Thank you, Erica, and your teams. Stay well and stay safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Perfect. We'll cut it off there. Thank you, Fat Guy.